So let's have a look at mitigation and NDC tracking. As many of you already know, a lot of questions before, after in the first Q&A went in that direction. Greenhouse gases are basically what accounts for the climate change phenomena that we see, the concentration in the atmosphere. And so what mitigation then does is, of course, it seeks to reduce those emissions in various sectors through various technologies or changes in behavior, anything we can imagine, and I will provide examples in this presentation. And in this context, we've just done the quiz as well. These NDCs are under the Paris Agreement, what drives countries to set up specific plans that correspond to the national context to reduce emissions. So what this agenda foresees is a very brief introduction on greenhouse gases and climate change, so their relationship, which was already mainly provided by Ravindra. Then we have a very brief look at greenhouse gas accounting and GHG inventories. This is very much background information, fundamentals, but we believe necessary to sort of create a bit of an understanding of what mitigation then is and what specific mitigation policies and measures are in that context. This links to nationally determined contributions, which we have discussed theoretically now, but we will have a look at how they are actually set up, what is needed to set them up, and what is needed to implement them. And then the last bit is a very relevant bit, is because NDC tracking is part of the ETF, reporting on progress and increasing ambition, and then also for Trinidad and Tobago, of course, through the NTS, the NDC tracking and mitigation works with specific indicators. Some of you have been involved, so we'll have a look at that to kind of conclude the topic of mitigation and NDC tracking. All right, let's get started. Greenhouse gases and climate change. Here we see the first slide. We've seen that slide sort of before in the previous presentation. We know climate change is caused by the greenhouse effect. It traps heat in the atmosphere, and human activity is emitting greenhouse gases at unprecedented rates since industrialization. We've seen some numbers to that. So greenhouse gases have been presented, carbon dioxide, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. Specific gases are linked to specific processes as well. So what is important is that when we look at these greenhouse gases, we need to know which gases are emitted, because they do have different global warming potentials, which means that they are expressed in units of carbon dioxide. Methane, 1 unit of methane, a mass unit, is about 28 times as, contributes about 28 times as much to global warming as 1 unit of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases even more. So it's important that we know what gases are being emitted to be able to properly account for the greenhouse gases. And the way this is accounted for on a national scale is using these IPCC guidelines, right? The International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what we look at is always the source where they are emitted or sequestered, which would be taking carbon out of the atmosphere, forests, for instance, right? The sources are organized in 4 different main sectors. It was introduced already. We have the energy sector. So these are emissions occurring through the primary combustion of fuels in energy and production, manufacturing industry, transport, and buildings. So a car that drives down a road, the emissions that are happening is because of the combustion process in the engine is accounted for within energy. Then we have industrial processes and product use. Here, what's important, industry is, of course, we know has a lot of emissions. Usually we associate the industry with emissions. What is important is that the energy consumption in those industries, burning natural gas, for instance, to pump the processes and so forth, this is accounted for in energy. However, there are specific emissions in the cement production process, in the ammonia production process, and so forth, which fall under IPPU, industrial process and product use. So if you have a big plant plant that produces a certain industrial good, it likely has emissions that are accounted for in both of these sectors, but it's important to link it to the relevant processes. Then we have agriculture, livestock mainly, and agricultural soils, and forestry and land use changes. Forestry and land use, of course, can be both emission. It's not typical emission through combustion that we think of, but if we change the land, if we cut down trees, we deforest, this is accounted as causing emissions. And if we reforest, we enhance our potential to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, which means that we are reducing emissions in the national accounting sphere. And then waste, solid landfills, solid waste landfills, or wastewater is also associated with mostly methane emissions. Here we have a look. There was a question before, where can we see the inventory? This is from the BOR that was mentioned before, from the last report of Trinidad and Tobago. Let's make this a bit bigger. This is just, you see in the last year, that was reported here, 2018. You have the sectors here, energy, IPPU, AFOLU, and waste. AFOLU is negative because there's more forests, let's say, that sequesters, then there's agricultural emission and so forth, and other land use emission. And then you have IPPU as the biggest category, which I would say is a very specific case for an island state. Usually you would see most emissions in the energy sector and then also in the land use sector. However, Trinidad and Tobago, as we know, through the oil and gas and the ammonia production, a lot of emissions are occurring in that sector. And this is why, the highest emissions are occurring in these categories, specifically through the energy production and chemical processing. Just to provide some context, because when we talk about mitigation now going forward, it's important to kind of understand what sectors emit, how do they emit, and what is kind of the national context of that. And this is just over the years. You see the total, the fluctuating total, not fluctuating that much, and the relevant distribution of the sectors contributing to that national total. Okay. So having spoken briefly now about greenhouse gases and how they are accounted and how it looks in the country, climate change mitigation. So what we mean with mitigation, I will read this because it's sort of an official definition, is that refers to actions taken to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as well as the improvement of carbon sinks aiming to mitigate the impacts of climate change, reforestation for instance. So mitigation efforts are essential to stabilize the concentrations of the atmosphere, limit global warming, and thus, to achieve the Paris Agreement, which is instated for that reason in the first place. Mitigation has a range of dimensions, if you want to call it like that. To know where to mitigate, it's important to know where you emit. So to have some idea of projection, so where are my emissions going, where am I opening a new chemical plant? Okay, these emissions will go up. This sort of information should feed into the process of devising a mitigation strategy, devising targeted mitigation actions. So these are linked projections and scenarios. Then, of course, the topic of policies and measures that groups together those policies, projects, measures, regulations that are implemented to address the greenhouse gases in a specific sector or in various sectors. To set objectives that are feasible and achievable. And for that we need to know the mitigation potential of specific projects and as they relate to our emission trajectory. So let's start with the topic of mitigation policies and measures. What are mitigation pumps? Pumps is mostly a term that's used in the European Union, but it is more and more used all around because it kind of comprises any action, intervention, regulation, incentive, tax you can imagine, as you see here listed by some examples, that aims at reducing future emission levels or enhancing carbon sinks, which is then the same effect. The scope, we talked about the regional scope and the national scope before in some comments. The scope of a PUM, of course, can also be national. It can be subnational, it can be local, it can be installing solar panels in a specific municipality. That is a very small pump probably. Its contribution to emission reduction will be small, but it contributes because the idea would be there, solar panels are installed, reducing the need for producing electricity through other means, through combustion processes, hence we would have less emissions. And pumps, as mentioned, this is why we need to look at our GHG inventory, our greenhouse gas inventory, should be formulated and implemented in view of where we actually have the emissions. And there's a few principles which we will be talking about that help guide us a bit to prioritize. And then the way that pumps mitigate emissions, for example, we had the solar panels, right? That for me would be a change of technology. Instead of burning coal, natural gas, whatever we can imagine, we use now solar panels, right? So we change our technology to reduce emission. We can also think of a change of regulation or behavior. We can decide to eat less meat. We reduce the need for livestock production. Or we can decide to only not drive on Sundays or in our cars, right? I mean, or it can be a regulation that mandates that. So change of regulation in consumer behavior can also be, let's say, a major umbrella of pumps that affect emissions through a change, right? And we have some examples here. I hope you can see it. For example, if we look at the energy sector, that was the example, installing renewable energy capacity of whichever type. We can also reduce energy sector emissions by reducing vehicle use. Right. So agriculture, we can have a look. We can change the technology, which could be we change the fertilizers that we use, or we have different soil management practices, innovative technologies to do so. We can change our behavior. We can eat less meat. To just give you another example, forestry and land use sector emissions. We can implement more effective restoration practices, new seeds, new practices, sort of to restore, to rezone our land, to then reforest and so forth. Or we can set in a regulation from government side. We say the deforestation rate cannot exceed 1% each year, something like that. That could also curb emissions. So how do we decide then, and how do we explain this in a general way first? How do we decide what pumps we should implement, right? So to kind of guide this process for prioritization, these three principles are suggested here. They don't have to be taken as like set in stone. Like, of course, there's a lot of cost benefit analysis, appropriateness, what is already going on in the country. There's limitations, technological limitations, and these two principles, what they try is to kind of englobe that, as you will see. So the principles are relevance, feasibility, and adequacy. We look at the first one, relevance. To know whether a pump is relevant, it should be sort of estimated. Its impact, so its potential to reduce emission, should be known a priori, should be known beforehand to have kind of an idea, is that even relevant? Like, we can pump a lot of money into reducing emissions, for example, in the waste sector. We have now landfills. I mean, landfills also have environmental damages that are happening that are not related to greenhouse gas, but if we only look at that, maybe we don't have many emissions in that sector, and maybe it's very costly to do so. So is that really relevant to do it, to kind of prioritize that? Or should we look at the sectors with the highest emissions and to the policies and measures which, in our estimation, in our assumption, has a substantial impact, right? So what helps here is to focus on key categories. In the inventories, for those of you who have worked with that, you might know, but otherwise key categories are those emissions categories in the inventory when you account for all the emissions in the country that together represent 95%. In many cases, that's only a handful, 10, 9, 12, 5, it depends, right? Here it would be definitely ammonia production, it would be road transport, and a few more that together already account for 95% of all the emissions in the country, right? So this is why also you are here today, because the NDC of Trinidad and Tobago is focusing on the energy, industry, and transport sector, which have the most emission. Until agriculture and land use is, of course, also improved, right? The accounting, and then we'll see. Then feasibility would be the next one. So once we have established, okay, it's relevant, we use that sector, and we have a pump, we have an idea, installing 1 gigawatt solar panels would help. Okay. Then we need to check, do we have the resources for that? Do we have technical feasibility? Do we have the potential even in our country And also, can we gather political and societal support? In my country, in Germany, a big problem, I don't know why. A lot of people have problems with windmills. So there's a lot of societal upheaval because the state wants to install windmills. Okay, so be it. But in terms of, like, when we think about feasibility, it's important that when prioritizing your policies and measures, think about what is feasible, what can actually be done. And is the technology ready in the country? Right? There's some technologies which are really advanced, and in some countries might not be a good idea because it's a long process of actually adopting them effectively. And the last one, adequacy, is closely linked, right? I would point here again to socially politically acceptable, right? So more than only to garner support, this would also point to whether it's acceptable, whether there's any damages that occur through a specific policy and measure. Let's think about hydropower now. We have a big river and we install a dam. We reduce renewable electricity, we reduce our need for combusting fuels, we reduce emissions, great, okay. We might have all this water in a dam now, and we have, and certain ecosystems that were close to the river or villages might experience a shortage of water. Is that really acceptable? It needs to be weighted, right? So we need to check whether a PAM, policy and measure for mitigation, is actually acceptable, and whether it's aligned with the development trajectory. If we have invested over the past years $5 billion in solar panels, it might not be wise to put suddenly 5 in windmills because of the investment cost and development cost and so forth. Okay, so this for the backdrop, and the last bit on mitigation policies and measures is now about estimating the impact, right? So we had relevance, knowing a bit how many emissions can we actually reduce from that. To do so, this is just very theoretical here. We see this small graph in the middle, baseline emissions after implementation, right? These are baseline emissions, how they evolve over the year. We implement a policy and measure. We have solar panels now, and that's the difference between the emission level would just be the impact of the pump. So what we compare are two scenarios. Let's say in our heads, what we should have is the two scenarios where we have the policy and measure and where we don't have it, to be able to compare and to be able to discern the impact, right? We have emissions that evolve like this, we implement the policy, and now they evolve like this. Difference being the impact. How do they reduce emissions? Well, we said regulation and behavior or technology. Okay, that was the first bit, and the second bit is that they can affect the activity of something, the magnitude, or the emission factor. If we have a coal plant, right? Let's take my country again. Sorry for the example, it just comes to my head right now, Germany. We have a lot of coal plants, or we used to have coal plants. Now we want to move to burning more, we have renewables, but also burning more natural gas. So that would not change the energy demand in the country. It would not change the magnitude, how much electricity we're needing, how much electricity we produce, but it would change the emission factor because we're using a different source to basically produce the electricity, like a lower emission factor of natural gas compared to coal. So that would be the example of an emission factor change, but we can also change the activity, the magnitude. That would be reducing or not driving our cars on Sunday, right? So we reduce our car use by 10% maybe over the week. So that decreases the magnitude while we don't change our fuel. We don't move to like less polluting fuels. We have the same fuels. We just drive less. So that would decrease then the activity and magnitude. And why is this important? Well, these were the examples that I would just mentioned. This is important because we need to know when we use the methodologies of the IPCC, there's emission factors associated with specific materials, or we have activity data times emission factor gives emission, right? So we need to know what our policy and measure impacts. Is it the activity? Is it the emission factor, right? To be able to do a proper estimation. And just to underline this, and then we close with mitigation policies and measures. I probably already talked about this, what some examples, but we assume that if we foresee a change in the activity, then the emission factor would remain stable. This helps with the estimation, and vice versa. Of course, we can imagine that there's policies which impact both, and that is also fine. But for simplicity, what's included here is, for instance, this example: install additional renewable energy capacity. It would be assumed that the electricity production capacity is the same. And of course, I know there's downstream effects. The equilibrium might shift. If we have models of energy demand and generation in the country, it might change. Energy capacity works with peak hours. Maybe there's some considerations. But this is a simple way of depicting that. So the production capacity is the same, but renewable electricity replaces the need for thermal energy, right, from combusting fuels. And replace diesel with biodiesel for trucks is the same. Now we assume the same number of trucks, 500, but we use biodiesel now for these 500 trucks, so we have less emissions. But we assume that the number of trucks is the same. This helps with estimating then the difference, right? We have one scenario where we have 500 trucks driving down the road with normal diesel, which has a specific emission factor. Let's call it 70. So we multiply that, and we have our emission from those 500 trucks. Then we use biodiesel, which has a much smaller emission factor, let's say 5. We multiply that, we have X emissions, no less. The difference is the impact of my policy and measure. My policy and measure in this case would be replacing diesel with biodiesel. So this is kind of the logic that we follow when estimating the impact of a policy and measure. Okay, and how does it link to the first presentation? All of what I've been talking about so far? Well, mainly, and how it affects all of us, is through the NDCs, which are the country's self-defined pledges to combat climate change within the framework of the Paris Agreement. And as you know, every 5 years they need to be ratcheted up, the ambition needs to be increased, and represent a progression towards the last one, and also to represent, if possible, the highest possible ambition of a country. That's hard to know, no? Like in many cases, it's difficult to know what can my ambition be, right? So how much can I actually reduce? What is feasible? What is a good target? It often becomes a bit arbitrary if the data foundation, the data processing foundation, and then also the capacity, of course, the knowledge on all of these topics is not sufficient. A lot of the pledges that country make are detached from what's actually going on. Now we see a lot of NDCs that propose a target, not to criticize these countries, but just to say that they're likely not in line with what's actually occurring or with what might actually be possible. So when developing these NDCs, a few things are important. A proper assessment of national circumstances. Setting ambitious targets, but also feasible targets. Doing what we do, sort of. Stakeholder consultations, talking to sectors. We saw energy sector, we have emissions, a lot of them. Specifically in these processes, we know it because we've done the inventory. So we can talk to the stakeholders where we know that they're involved in these activities that cause emissions. So we talk to them, what is possible technologically, or we talk to policymakers. Can we do a regulation maybe? There's a lot of talk that needs to feed a development process of an NDC. Integrating this with national policies and plans. We have a development trajectory of a country that is set beyond emissions reduction. That's not the only thing a country needs to consider. We try to bring that together, right? Formulation of implementation strategies, theory into action, clear action plans. What Trinidad and Tobago did early on, which is a really great thing, is to develop an NDC implementation plan, which really, really helps countries, because an NDC is often a short document that states the target and says, we do this until 2030. Okay, fair enough. But with an NDC implementation plan, really by sector, specific activities are defined. Responsible ministries, responsible companies for the data, for tracking the progress. And with that, you really, as a country, embark more on a clear path on what you actually need to do. And then this is submission of the NDC, tracking and updating, within the timeframes as indicated. Stakeholders to be involved. We have a lot of these examples here present today. Government agencies, civil society organizations, private sector entities across the board, academics, indigenous people and local communities, of course, as well, international organizations and donors. Let's say this is a national sphere, or also local, and this would be, international organizations sometimes have also quality data that can help with the NDCs, or also we can look to data of international organizations to kind of locate ourselves. Okay, what do different, similar countries do? Where do we have similarities? What do they do? What is their target? So we need to look to that. And as mentioned, there's challenges, right? The ambition and equity, data constraints, capacity constraints, properly integrating that with what's going on in the sector, resources, adaptation, which is actually an interesting thing. Further down this week, there will be a lot more talk about adaptation, and on Friday specifically also on the interaction between adaptation and mitigation planning in the processes. Just to mention this briefly, adaptation, reducing vulnerabilities, enhancing resilience is a key thing as well. It's not only about reducing emissions, it's also about sheltering against the impacts, which will hit anyway, and in some way or form. So sometimes mitigation policies and measures are implemented, targets are set, which might be actually detrimental to adaptation priorities, or vice versa. So it's important to consider this intersection. And just as a last slightly technical thing on NDCs, if we look at this and we look at the challenges, one of the main one, and this was what I mentioned before, just sort of in free speech, that countries have issues setting proper targets, ambitious targets that are linked really to what is happening in the country and what is possible in the country. We need to look at the sort of targets which we can set, right? There's different types of targets as well. There can be relative emission reduction targets below a business as usual scenario or level. What that means, BAU, business as usual, it would be a projection of the economy and the population and any other variables which help us determine or to project into the future how our emissions will evolve. There's tools, there's softwares that can help us. We can use our brains, of course, we can use Excel, we can use whatever we want, but make assumptions. But it would be to kind of paint the trajectory of a country to see, okay, our emissions probably will develop like this because this is our development trajectory. So this mitigation target would be relative, right? So we keep developing our country, we keep growing economically. Probably even the population is going to keep growing. And we have a business as usual scenario, which would be, we set expecting our growth, we expect to have these emissions. But if we set a target, respecting our growth, we assume the same growth economically, but we want to have only 85% of that, let's say. So it's a 15% reduction. We want to have less. Then there can be absolute emission targets. We want to reduce 5,000 kilotons of greenhouse gases every year, or by 2030, right? Then we can have the same relative to a base year. We want to, that's what a lot of countries also do. We want to have 5,000 kilotons of CO2 equivalent less than compared to 1990 levels that we had. Can be an intensity target, a peaking target, which is, for instance, or intensity is, well, we have a look at that. Maybe that's even easier. So these were explained. Intensity targets, they're sort of absolute emissions target, but it's in terms of a certain output, unit output, right? So some countries, what they say is, okay, instead of saying I will reduce X emissions, or these are my two scenarios and I want to have only percentage of that, I say my emission reduction will be that per unit output of GDP, I only have 2 instead of 4, something like that. So it would be that the intensity of your economy producing greenhouse gases would reduce, and that would be the target. Peaking target is a certain year is set, a target year, and in that year we want to have maximally this amount of emissions. And then there's another case, policies and actions, where countries do not report or do not pledge to have a specific target, but they only include certain activities. Trinidad and Tobago has this one. It's in many countries the case. Business as usual scenario. It was projected how the economy is going to grow and the population until 2030. And based on that, the emission trajectory was kind of estimated. And now the idea is that across these three sectors that are present here as well today, transport, industry, and energy, that there will be a 15% reduction. This was mentioned. Adaptation targets are also something to potentially include in NDCs, but it can also be included in other communications. I don't want to dive too deep into this. Just know countries have also the liberty to talk about adaptation in their NDCs, but NDCs mainly are geared towards mitigation. So how to implement this? How to implement your NDCs? Well, first, we're working in this policy sphere. Now countries have their development plans, their rules, their systems, and so forth. So we need to see that our NDC is aligned with those. So it starts with the policies and frameworks, really with the regulatory legal basis as well, where we ensure coherence across sectors, government agencies, interests, needs. Finance is a big thing, maybe one of the biggest. Mobilizing resources, right? So we can mobilize resources from international donors, from the community that's specifically geared towards climate funding. Likely not enough. We need our domestic budget as well. We need to pump money ourselves. If that's a fair thing or not to do as a country that's not responsible is another question, of course. Then the private sector is a great source of funding in many cases, if controlled correctly. So it needs to be considered that in NDC, if we just put a target very high, then it's probably not feasible because we might logically not get to the resources for that. Then NDC implementation plans was already mentioned. Well, help to set countries on a path, right? Clearly depict which sectors, which activities, who's responsible, how often do we monitor, and so forth. And we need technology transfer and capacity building. This is going to be part of the last presentation today on support as well. These are two terms basically where also support is required by all countries. Because to be able to do all of this, we need the technologies in many cases, and we need the capacities, the skills of people like you, to be able to understand what a good target, a sound target would be, to understand what a sound mitigation policy can be, how to know whether it is sound, and how to bring this together, and how to align this with national development goals. And to do so, of course, stakeholder engagement. This is just an overview of what was mentioned. Just to keep in mind, we don't have a quiz now, but if we had a quiz now, I would pay attention to this. So key aspects are ambition raising every 5 years, ratcheting up, policy coherence, stakeholder engagement, consultations. We need data, collection, analysis, and alignment with international goals as well. So just to cut this presentation, we're already 2/3 through, no worries, but just to cut this a bit, we saw now greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas emissions. How can we reduce emission? What is mitigation? What are pumps, policies and measures? How do they address climate change? What are NDCs? What's their purpose? How are they developed? What do we need to consider to develop them? So based on these concepts that we have seen now, we're going to see the NDC implementation in Trinidad and Tobago. This is focused on the implementation plan. So this is where I see familiar faces. You will have as a moment of, oh, I've seen this. Because this is the implementation plan of Trinidad and Tobago. And from this plan, what has been done over the past 2 years is that specific indicators were developed. And these indicators help Trinidad and Tobago to track the progress of the NDC, right? We will look at the NDC, we'll see it on the slide. Mr. Kumar Singh already at the beginning mentioned the goals, and we'll see them again. So just to have the logic in our heads is that we have those targets that are set, we have the plan for the sectors, and now we developed indicators which help us, because if we have data on these indicators, we can know to what percentage we are achieving our targets. Are there any questions at this point? Just to provide the floor, otherwise I would continue, and then we can also do this in the end. All right. Okay. Then what is NDC tracking? Quickly, NDC tracking is connected, of course, to achieving NDCs. every 2 years with the BTRs. Well, NDCs updated every 5 years, but reported on progress every 2 biannual transparency reports from end of this year onwards. And the Paris Agreement sets the framework for that, right? We have the modalities, procedures, and guidelines under the ETF. We have, this was mentioned already, common tabular formats. We have narrative form. We need to report on this in a specific way. And every country will do the same. It will be the same tables from all countries, specific, of course, to their targets and to their policies and measures. And why is it important? Of course, to evaluate progress. For countries themselves, this international community will not assess the adequacy. A country should do that. A country should know, okay, we've done now 3 BTRs, we have 6 years down the line, we're not achieving this goal, like, or what we wanted for this sector is not happening, so we might to refine, or we might have to maybe tweak this target a bit, or put more efforts into this. So this is, of course, for a country and in a vision, an important thing to track progress, to see where the country needs to improve. To the outside, it shows transparency, it shows accountability, it shows a country is doing its share, a country is actually being involved. And it helps all of us to compare. It helps not to compare how bad or good we're doing compared to a specific other country, but how on a global scale we're faring on reducing the emissions, like to not have more global warming than we want. So to see kind of, to have these moments of reflection to like, okay, we have all these progresses on NDCs worldwide, and this means that we are reducing emission by this amount. Are we in a good path? Do we need to refine? We need to see. So what needs to be reported for NDC tracking in the biannual transparency reports? Well, so circumstances, explain what's going on in your country. It helps always to explain these are our industries, these are our activities, this is what our economy is focused on, so include this. Then of course, right, the emissions inventory, this is separate, like you can think of it separate from the NDCs, but it is related, of course. No, it's related to the NDC is the accounted emissions of the country. Then the NDC itself, the information on policies and measures, projections, we don't touch upon this, but I briefly explained, right, our expectation of how the trajectory of emission is gonna go into the future, and then reporting on this in sort of like using the formats that are provided. And the formats, this was briefly mentioned in the first presentation, we have next to the narrative part. The narrative part can be, you can imagine a BTR being a long document, 300 pages, and you can have a few pages that explain in words what is going on, what are the main measures that we're implementing. But what the UNFCCC wants to see from all countries in this instance is these tables, because these tables will then, you can put them next to each other, you can combine them, you have a comparable way of seeing and a clear way for all countries to report on the same items. And then the 2 relevant ones for the BTRs are 4 and 5, CTF 4 and 5. And to be able to do so, yeah, progress indicators support monitoring of progress. We'll have a look at that in a bit. Very briefly, CTF 4, reporting on NDC progress. So this, think about only the NDC. Think about your targets. We can have a target compared to reference scenario, an absolute target. We talk about these main targets. What countries report here is an indicator. An indicator. A unit, a reference point, the years, an end year, a target level, and a progress made. Can be percentage, can be a total number if it's an absolute target. Indicators are in most cases directly linked, or should be directly linked with the target, right? So an indicator relates to a target by being able to, with data or with some sort of input, know how good we are on this target. If we have, let's say we want to reduce 5,000 kilotons. So an indicator would be a reduction of, no, it would be just the kilotons that we are emitting. Let's not think about a sector, economy-wide. National emissions, 5,000 down by 2030, okay. So indicator would be the amount of emissions we are emitting. So if we see 2,000, well, we're there 40% of the way. And what in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, what is done is that countries can add rows for each additional indicator, because we have this implementation plan which helps us achieve this target, because only the target out there might be a bit imprecise. So there's more, I think I was speaking next to the microphone for a while, okay, can put additional targets and additional indicators, let's say. And these additional indicators are developed for these sectors: transport, industry, and energy. And in the exercise, you will also see this with a bit more information. And in the reporting, these indicators would also have to be added here, and the progress that is explained, how the progress can be measured on each of these, would have to be included. It's another table. This is policies and measures only. So policies and measures which of course help to achieve the NDC. This is a bit separate in the sense that what we need to report is individual policies and measures. But please, not every single one. Not that your neighbor installed a solar panel, because that is a very small one. If you report on all of this, it will be 10,000 pages. So maybe the largest emission action, pool them together, right? A major economy-wide thing of reducing energy intensity in the industry or something like that, right? So this would be a major policy and measure, and we would have to describe it, the objective, the sectors, the gases, who's implementing it, and how much of it is achieved. So this together, or these two tables together, represent the main reporting requirements related to NDC and mitigation, right? The main policies and measures we're implementing, and our NDC, and how good we are at achieving it at the moment, and then going forward every 2 years, we update this. How is this done in Trinidad and Tobago? We've seen the NTS, National Transparency System, that covers different areas in the MRV system. And through this NTS, responsibilities of key institutions are defined. You know potentially more about this than me as well. Like, it's a platform, it's a data system, key stakeholders, right, have then the mandate to submit data in a periodic way through this platform, where it will be quality assured, quality checked, where it will be further processed. Then it is up to the EMA, of course, to develop the reports and so forth. So this englobes sort of the system, the national response of the country to these requirements. How do we do the BTRs? How do we do these tables? Through providing data to the system, processing to the system, and optimally having an effective way to do so. And just a few more minutes. I know this is long, this presentation. Progress indicators. I won't spend too much time on this. It's just for you to see it and to have maybe this little aha moment for those who have been involved previously. Indicators are what helps us track a target or an objective. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, right? They should be smart, well-defined. They should be measuring the progress. They should be within reach, attainable, clearly defined, and we need data for that. And what we are tracking here in the country, in Trinidad and Tobago, are these NDC objectives, as mentioned previously, unconditionally 30% reduction from the business as usual, what is projected in the public transportation sector. Unconditionally means Trinidad and Tobago is saying we pay for this ourselves, to put it in the most simple way. Conditional, 15% reduction from the business as usual from power generation, transport, and industry. Conditional, we would like international support. Most countries have something like this. Most countries have, let's say, a more ambitious or a more difficult to attain target that is conditional, right? Because it requires additional resources, and an unconditional one which is achievable mobilizing national resources. And for these targets and for these sectors specifically, what has been developed in this process, this is a depiction of the process that was connected to the CBIT project, and that was done over the past years. That we have these commitments, then we have the implementation plan, and we have our sectors. And we have in the implementation plan activities, right? 33, we can think of pumps, right? It can be 33 pumps, 31 pumps, 30 pumps. This is a bit much to track all these activities by themselves, like we're getting here to 100 almost, right? So they have been subsumed in with specific indicators, grouped, pooled, because they are very similar. So some activities read the same, they were about the same. Energy efficiency in the industry, for instance. Okay, we pooled together some indicators. We came up with 9, or the country came up with 9, and in total, 23 indicators are validated or are being used then by the NTS to track progress on the NDC implementation. So these are the 3 sectors: power generation, industry, and transport. Next to the specific activities, they have a sectoral one, which is just directly linked to the emissions, an overall one that can even, if we think about it, we can have a lot of measures. We can have increased uptake of public transportation, reduced vehicle use. We talk about transport now. Changing our fuels. Okay. We can do all that. We can track all this progress, and it's probably important to see how the implementation is going to go. But if we report and we only have the target in mind, right? We want to decrease emissions. We can look at the emissions, and we already know. We look at our inventory, and we know, okay, we're achieving our target or not. But to be able to achieve that target, we need to know more information. This is why this implementation plan with its indicators helps the country to know where problems are, where we're doing fine, and where we might need to readjust, right? This is just a little overview of how this has been, of how these have been combined into specific indicators. You'll see some examples. And this is just the last example, and then that concludes the presentation already. This is from the power generation energy sector. The indicator, so the name of the mitigation area is promotion of renewable energy. We used this example already today, some sort of this example. The indicator would be the share of renewable energy in the overall national production, energy production. This helps to reduce emissions, of course. And the target value, 30% by 2030. So what do we need to estimate that progress? We need to see different sources of renewable energy, potential sources, solar, other renewables like biomass and then hydropower, wind. And we need to gauge progress using some sort of formula, of course, to see what the percentage actually is. Like, are we getting to 30%? We have our national grid, the energy mix, right, the production. We want renewables to make up 30% of that. We put all of this in here, and we see are we at 19%, so 11 to go to reach a target. So this would be an example, a good example, I think, of a progress indicator that really shows, okay, by using certain pieces of information, which probably need to be provided by utility providers, big companies that have projects in this field, maybe the Ministry of Energy, or related departments, that sort of kind of can help this progress, this process, and can thus help the country to estimate how well we're doing on these indicators.